high above the blue ridge, wrapped in mist and mountain wind, there stands a white marble palace that still watches the valley below, as if time itself never quite reached it. It had electricity when many nearby towns were still dark. It had an elevator when farmers were lighting their homes with oil lamps. It once held a Tiffany-stained glass window, worth more than an entire generation's lifetime of labor. Then everyone left. The owners died. The money ran out. History moved on, but the house did not. Swannanoa stood abandoned for decades, vandalized, forgotten, declared dead. And yet, somehow, it never disappeared from the memory of these mountains. Some places grow more unsettling the longer they are left behind, not because of what remains visible, but because of what seems unwilling to leave. People argue about Swannanoa. Some call it the final masterpiece of a vanished age. Others believe it carries something heavier, a residue of ambition, of devotion, of promises built in stone, but never secured against time. So what is truly at risk here? Just a decaying mansion, or the story it refuses to release? Stay long enough, and it becomes clear this is not an ordinary house. Its life followed a strange cycle, built at the absolute height of power, abandoned far longer than any dream should endure, then revived in a form no one could have predicted. And that leads to the real question: who was the first person to believe he could build something that outlived time itself? To answer that, we have to go back to one man, one war, and one promise placed on this mountain. If stories like this matter to you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Now, let's return to where it all began. May 05, 1862, Williamsburg, Virginia. That morning did not begin with a catastrophe. It was simply another engagement in the Peninsula Campaign, where tens of thousands of soldiers had grown accustomed to mud, gunpowder, and death arriving without warning. Among them was James Henry Dooley, 21 years old, a private in the Confederate infantry. He did not come from poverty. The Dooley family was one of the rare Irish immigrant families in Richmond that possessed both wealth and education in the mid-19th century. His father, John Dooley, had built a successful hat manufacturing business, then invested early in railroads, an industry still in its infancy as America was being stitched together by steel and steam. It was a family that understood one thing clearly: whoever controlled infrastructure controlled the future. James grew up inside that belief. He entered Georgetown College at 15 and graduated in 1860 as the top student of his class for all 4 years. At an age when most young men had barely left home, James was already being shaped to become a lawyer, a statesman, a broker of power. Then the war came. In April 1862, James enlisted alongside his father and his brother, John Dooley. They joined a militia unit composed largely of Irish Richmonders, men who had found prosperity in the South and now believed they had to defend it. Williamsburg was the first major battle James ever experienced. It was also his last. A Union bullet tore through the formation. James was hit and collapsed to the ground. There was no heroic moment, no trumpet call. Only wet earth, blood, and the strange silence that follows gunfire. In those few seconds, he witnessed a truth no classroom could teach. Everything, even the grandest plans, could end instantly. James did not die. He was captured, later exchanged in a routine prisoner swap common in that phase of the war. His wound forced a medical discharge, ending his military service after a single battle. But what left Williamsburg was not just an injured soldier. Part of the man James had been remained on that field. While James carried memories he never put into words, his brother John recorded everything. John Dooley kept a war diary of terrifying precision. He wrote about bodies stacked together, about the screams of the wounded at night, about the long, meaningless stretches of waiting between artillery barrages. Those pages would later be published, becoming one of the most candid first-hand accounts of a Confederate soldier's experience during the Civil War. James did not write. He carried what is now called survivor's guilt, the burden of having lived when others did not. The war was not yet over, but something fundamental had already shifted. James was reassigned to the Confederate Ordnance Department, away from the front lines, away from gunfire, but never away from memory. Then, in 1865, the war ended. James returned to Richmond. His city had been burned in the final days of the Confederacy. The Dooley family's hat factory, their primary source of income, no longer existed. Everything had vanished, exactly as he had seen it vanish at Williamsburg. But this is where the story turns. James did not collapse into despair. He returned to Georgetown to complete his education, then came back to Richmond to practice law in a defeated city, where old power structures had fallen and new ones had not yet formed. It was inside that vacuum that a psychological seed began to grow. If everything could be taken away in seconds, then the only defense was to build something large enough, solid enough, beautiful enough to force time itself to hesitate. The bullet of 1,862 did not kill James Dooley, but it killed the man he had been, and from that moment forward, every decision he made carried the same imprint, an obsession born from the knowledge that fragile things must be built in stone. But what happens when a man survives war, carries the certainty that everything can vanish, and begins trying to challenge that law itself? The answer does not appear yet. It arrives when a woman enters the story, at precisely the moment Richmond is still smoldering beneath its layer of ash. In 1865, Richmond did not collapse because of a single battle. It collapsed because the war had ended. As Confederate forces withdrew from the city, fire spread through the commercial center, warehouses, factories, and offices burned during the final days of the conflict. Among them was the Dooley family's hat factory, a business that had supported dozens of workers and provided steady income for the family for decades. This loss was not merely personal. It reflected a larger reality. The entire pre-war economic class of Richmond was disappearing along with the Confederacy. After 1865, the South did not simply lack money, it lacked structure. Laws still existed on paper, but real power was being redistributed. Families that had once been wealthy now had to learn how to survive within a new order imposed by the victors. James Dooley returned to the city at precisely that moment. He did not return as a wounded veteran seeking sympathy. He returned as a man trained to read laws, contracts, and ownership in a society that was being rewritten. James went back to Georgetown to complete his education, then returned to Richmond to practice law. His clients were no longer the old elite. They were landowners, businessmen, and families struggling to retain property and influence under unfamiliar legal frameworks. This was where James began to enter power, not through wealth, but through his ability to interpret and shape the new rules of the game. 4 years after the war, another event occurred, quieter but far more consequential. In 1869, James Dooley married Sally May. Sally did not come from Richmond. She was raised in Staunton, at the foothills of the Blue Ridge, far from the political and commercial centers of the state. Born into an old Virginia family, she was shaped by traditions tied to land, family, and continuity rather than markets and transactions. Her mother died when Sally was still very young. Her childhood lacked stability, but it gave her something else, a worldview less concerned with direct power and more concerned with order, beauty, and endurance. This marriage was not a merger of fortunes. It was a union of two perspectives. James entered the marriage thinking like a man, learning how to navigate a reconstructed South. Sally entered it, seeking to create a life defined by balance, aesthetics, and permanence, from 1,869 to roughly 1,880. They functioned as a strategic partnership. James expanded his influence within law and local politics. Sally built social standing, cultural networks, and aesthetic standards within Richmond's emerging elite. No grand buildings were erected during this period. No monumental symbols were unveiled. Only careful, deliberate accumulation. While many Southern families remained trapped in post-war survival, James and Sally were learning how to operate within the new order and quietly preparing for something larger. This marriage did not immediately produce wealth, but it produced something more important, an alliance stable enough to withstand power, and strong enough to carry a vision that extended beyond ordinary domestic life. The question would emerge soon after. As money and influence began to return, would they use them to adapt to the new system, or to build something that stood entirely outside of it? The answer was not in Richmond. It waited on a mountain, hundreds of miles away. After the war, Southern land was lost. James Dooley bought railroads. This was not a metaphor. It was how power was redistributed in the late 19th century. When the guns fell silent, the South entered a reconstruction far more brutal than battle. The land remained, but the future belonged to those who controlled the movement of goods and people. James Dooley understood this earlier than most. By the late 1872, Dooley joined the board of the Richmond and Danville Railroad, a struggling regional line connecting southern cities weakened by war. At first, it was just another transportation company fighting to survive. But railroads had something land did not. They connected power. Throughout the 1,880 seconds, the Richmond and Danville network expanded rapidly. New lines stretched across Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, pushing deeper into the South. By the early 1,890 seconds, the system controlled nearly 9,000 miles of track, making it one of the largest rail networks in the United States at the time. But power always carries risk. In 1893, the United States plunged into one of the most severe financial crises of the century. Hundreds of banks collapsed. Thousands of businesses failed. Railroads, burdened by massive debt from aggressive expansion, began to fall one after another. The Richmond and Danville system stood on the edge of collapse, and this is where the story turns. While many investors were wiped out, Dooley did not disappear with the old structure. In 1894, the network was reorganized under the leadership of Drexel Morgan and Company and reborn as the Southern Railway. James Dooley was not pushed aside. He entered the new structure with even greater influence. This was not luck. It was the result of standing in the right place when power was being rewritten. Southern Railway quickly became the backbone of Southern infrastructure, controlling the flow of transportation, commerce, and labor, and Dooley sat near the center of that system. He expanded his reach further through the Seaboard Airline Railway, helping connect Richmond to Florida and the major southern ports. At the same time, he held positions within the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, weaving power across multiple transportation networks. By the end of the 19th century, James Dooley's fortune was estimated between $5 and $6 million, adjusted for modern value. That figure represents hundreds of millions today. Wealth carried him back into politics. James was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates and quickly became a respected voice within the conservative legislative bloc. But his influence extended beyond the State House. As a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant Southern society, Dooley built authority through philanthropy. For more than 50 years, he served St. Joseph's Orphanage, contributing not only funds but governance. In his will, he would leave $3 million to the institution, the largest single gift ever made to a Catholic charity in the United States at that time. While James rebuilt power through infrastructure and institutions, Sally Dooley pursued a different path. In 1886, the couple purchased a dairy farm along the James River west of Richmond. Over the next 7 years, the land was transformed into Maymont, an estate covering nearly 100 acres. Maymont was not simply a home. It was an aesthetic declaration. Italian gardens with terraced fountains, a Japanese garden with koi ponds and wooden bridges, a Romanesque mansion filled with furniture and art collected during their travels through Europe and Asia. Maymont became Sally's laboratory, a place to test an idea she never abandoned, that beauty, carefully ordered, could exist outside the violence of markets and power. But even Maymont was not enough. Sally never released her attachment to Staunton, to the Blue Ridge Mountains where she had grown up. While James mapped power across the South in steel and schedules, Sally's gaze lifted toward a different space, higher, more isolated, a place where power and time might be redefined. When people begin to believe they have survived war, financial collapse, and political ruin, a dangerous thought emerges. Perhaps history itself has been conquered, and if history can be overcome, then the next thing to challenge is time. But what happens when power, wealth, and the fear of death converge into a single dream? The answer does not lie along the rail lines. It waits on a mountain, where James Dooley is about to make the most consequential decision of his life. In 1911, James Dooley was nearly 70 years old. At an age when most of his contemporaries had already withdrawn from public life, he made a decision that defied conventional economic logic. He wanted to build a palace, not in the city, not near rail lines, but on the summit of a remote mountain. The chosen site was Rockfish Gap, where the Blue Ridge opens toward two major valleys of Virginia. This was not farmland, not a commercial center, but an isolated mountain region, where weather was unforgiving and roads barely existed. James purchased roughly 1,000 acres of land. A large figure, but its value at the time lay not in acreage, but in separation, no neighbors, no town, no existing economic history to obey. And this is where the story turns. The construction of Swannanoa did not unfold like a real estate project. It was organized like a campaign. More than 300 craftsmen were brought up the mountain. They came from different countries and spoke different languages. Stonecutters, woodcarvers, metalworkers, ceiling artisans, each carrying skills passed down through generations. The average wage was $1.50 per day, respectable pay for skilled labor at the time, but earned at the cost of isolation. These workers lived on the mountain, far from their families, laboring under unpredictable weather, hauling massive materials by animal and human force. Georgia marble was transported in enormous blocks, dragged uphill by mule teams along unfinished mountain roads. Carrara marble from Italy, the same stone used in European Renaissance monuments, was ordered and shipped across the Atlantic for a project with no commercial return. Inside, every decision rejected efficiency. Ceilings were carved by hand. Walls were lined with hand-tooled leather. Spaces were designed to impress, not to economize. Then there was one detail that elevated the entire structure beyond architecture: a Tiffany stained glass window, commissioned from Tiffany Studios in New York. Its cost at the time reached $100,000, a sum most Americans would never encounter in a lifetime. Adjusted for modern value, it represents several $1,000,000 today. The window did not depict a conventional biblical scene. It portrayed Sally Dooley as Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music and art, standing within a garden of flowers. This was not decoration, it was a declaration, placed above the grand staircase. The image commanded every line of sight. The house did not revolve around James Dooley's power. It revolved around the memory and presence of the woman who had walked beside him throughout his life. The name Swannanoa was no accident. It echoed the symbol of the swan, a creature Sally deeply admired, known for lifelong devotion to its mate. Every detail of the palace pointed toward a single purpose: not the future, but memory. The total cost of construction reached approximately $2 million in 1912, an immense sum equivalent to nearly $50 million today, poured into a place that generated no profit, supported no industry, and served no political display. This was not a summer home, not a symbol of wealth. The palace was built as a shrine, a space where James Dooley attempted to fix in stone the things he feared losing: love, memory, and the belief that some things deserve to endure forever. But here, a paradox began to form. Swannanoa was completed after years of labor, yet by the time its marble walls finally stood finished, both James and Sally were already past the peak of their lives. So what happens when a shrine is completed too late? 8 years of construction, exchanged for 12 summers. When Swannanoa was finally ready to be lived in, James Dooley was already in his 70s. Sally was nearing 80. The palace had not been born for banquets, not for power, but for the slow rhythm of two people who had nearly reached the end of their lives. Life at Swannanoa was quiet. There were no political guests, no grand receptions. In the mornings, Sally descended the marble terraces, walking among flower beds she had personally chosen and arranged. She did not supervise. She touched the soil, trimmed, watched the light shift across each step of stone. James spent most of his time in the library or the Oriental Den. He read, wrote letters, attended to the final matters of a railroad empire that continued to function, even as its founder withdrew from the center. The air inside Swannanoa carried a rare kind of silence, not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of late fulfillment. In the evenings, they sat on the terrace overlooking the Shenandoah Valley. They spoke little. They did not need to speak. But time does not pause for a beautiful dream. In November 1922, James Dooley suffered a stroke in Richmond. The man who had survived war, financial collapse, and repeated reinventions of power died at the age of 81. Swannanoa became a house without its axis. Sally continued to return to the mountain each summer, but those who saw her noticed the change. Still tended the flowers. Yet the palace had lost its shared breath. On September 05, 1925, Sally Dooley died in the Swan Room, the chamber designed solely for her, surrounded by swan imagery and the final light filtering through the Tiffany window. She was 79 years old. There were no children, no direct heirs. What remained was a will. James left $3 million to St. Joseph's Orphanage, the largest donation ever made to a Catholic institution in the United States at that time. Sally distributed millions to the Richmond Public Library, a children's hospital, the Episcopal Diocese, and donated Maymont to the city to become a public park. Their love did not continue through bloodlines. It was converted into institutions. And Swannanoa, it did not exist within anyone's long-term plans. The dream remained. But the dreamers were gone. The palace outlived the two people who created it. Yet, it no longer had a clear reason to continue, and that is when the story enters its most dangerous phase. What happens to a monumental dream when no one needs it anymore? After Sally Dooley's death, Swannanoa was no longer a symbol. It became an asset. There was no direct heir, no one left who carried memory tied to every terrace, every garden, and when memory disappears, value becomes a number on paper. Just 1 year after Sally's death, Swannanoa was sold for approximately $300,000. A palace that had cost $2 million in 1912, nearly $50 million in today's value, changed hands for a fraction of its original worth. The buyer was the Valley Corporation of Richmond. They did not purchase a love story. The plan was simple: transform Swannanoa into a country club for Virginia's elite, a summer escape, a place for leisure, not memory. In 1927, the Swannanoa Country Club officially opened. An 18-hole golf course stretched across the mountain slopes. Tennis courts, swimming pools, and even a small airstrip for private planes appeared. The Marble Palace began hosting an entirely different class of guests, and during this period, a new layer of story emerged. The United States was in the era of prohibition. Alcohol was illegal nationwide. But Swannanoa's isolation and auxiliary buildings made it the center of rumors. Whispers spread that a stone building near the main gate served as a moonshine distillery. Illicit whiskey was said to flow from the mountain, catering to guests who preferred discretion. These stories were never officially confirmed, but they spread widely enough to become part of Swannanoa's reputation. In 1928, President Calvin Coolidge and his wife visited Swannanoa for Thanksgiving. The visit was symbolic. A sitting president's presence elevated the estate into a playground of power, a place where national rules seemed to soften in the mountains. But the glamour did not last. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression began. The wealthy class that sustained the country club disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Membership fees stopped. Guests stopped coming. Maintaining a marble palace on a mountaintop became an impossible burden. By 1932, the Valley Corporation defaulted. Swannanoa was reclaimed through foreclosure and returned to the Dooley sisters. But the conditions had changed. There was no money, no momentum, no reason to hold on. The golf course closed. The country club dissolved, and this time no one stepped in to replace it. Swannanoa was abandoned. For the next 17 years, the palace stood alone on the mountain, without owners, without purpose, without an official narrative, only wind, rain, and curious visitors began climbing the mountain road to peer into a dream that had been sold cheaply and left behind. But this abandonment was not the end. In truth, it was only the pause before Swannanoa entered the strangest chapter of its entire life cycle. Who would be the next person to believe they could save a dream that had already died? 17 years of abandonment turned Swannanoa into a void. No power, no love, no protected memory, and places like that tend to attract very particular people. In 1948, a man named Walter Russell appeared on the mountain road leading to Swannanoa. Russell was born in 1,871 inches Boston. He was not an obscure mystical drifter. Before entering a controversial world of ideas, he was already a recognized artist, a portrait painter, sculptor, and self-taught composer. He created busts of Mark Twain and Thomas Edison, and was once commissioned by President Franklin Roosevelt to produce nationally symbolic works. But Russell believed art was only the surface. In 1921, he claimed to have undergone an awakening that lasted 39 days and nights. During that period, according to Russell, the structure of the universe was revealed to him. He called this state cosmic consciousness, a condition in which science, spirituality, and creativity merge. Mainstream science rejected these claims, but Russell was not seeking academic approval. He was seeking believers. And this is where the story turns. In 1946, an English woman named Daisy Cook read Russell's writings and believed she had found the person she was meant to follow. She contacted Russell and later left Europe for the United States. 2 years afterward, Russell divorced his first wife and married Daisy, who changed her name to Lao Russell, inspired by the philosopher Laozi. They were not looking for a home. They were looking for a center. When they arrived at Swannanoa, Lao Russell believed the place matched images she had seen during spiritual experiences. A forgotten palace, an isolated space, a site distant enough from the world to teach a new truth. Russell leased Swannanoa for 50 years and began restoring it in a way unlike any previous owner, not to live in it, not to profit from it, but to teach. Rooms once reserved for elite guests became exhibition halls and lecture spaces. Silent corridors turned into places for discussion about light, energy, and cosmic cycles. In 1957, the University of Science and Philosophy was officially chartered by the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was not a university in the traditional sense. Most instruction was conducted through correspondence courses. Yet its scale was startling. By the late 1972, the institution reported approximately 55,000 students worldwide, people who never set foot on Swannanoa but believed knowledge from this place could reshape how they understood the universe and themselves. On the grounds, Walter Russell erected a statue of Christ with arms extended toward the valley below, calling it the Christ of the Blue Ridge, a symbol that was religious, philosophical, and controversial all at once. Celebrities visited. Curious politicians appeared. Spiritual seekers treated Swannanoa as a place of pilgrimage, but this revival was always misaligned. Swannanoa had been built to preserve the memory of a very specific love. Now it housed ideas unrelated to that memory. In 1963, Walter Russell died at the age of 90 at Swannanoa itself. He did not say he had died. He said he had refolded, returning to cosmic consciousness. Lau Russell continued to run the institution for decades, but the central energy was gone. In 1988, Lau Russell died. 10 years later, the University of Science and Philosophy left Swannanoa and relocated to Waynesboro. The palace was empty again, this time not because of lack of money, not because of war, but because no one left truly believed the place belonged to them. Swannanoa had lived through another cycle, but it was a life out of alignment with its original purpose. So what happens to a place that was loved completely, then occupied by a different belief, and finally abandoned once more? Was Swannanoa ever truly revived? Or did it simply learn how to survive longer in a form increasingly distant from itself? Today, Swannanoa is still there, no longer magnificent, no longer whole, white marble walls stained by time, gardens once measured down to each stone step, now swallowed by weeds. The palace stands on the mountain like a question that was never fully answered. The Dulaney family has held Swannanoa for generations, not for profit, but because no one among them has been able to let it go. They preserve what they can within human limits, facing overwhelming costs, relentless decay, and a legacy larger than any individual. There is no perfect plan, only a very human kind of helplessness. And in that space, another story begins to grow. People say, Swannanoa is haunted. Footsteps in empty corridors, doors that close on their own. The feeling of being watched when no one is there. But perhaps ghosts are not the dead. Ghosts are emotions that were never released. Love built in stone, but never given enough time to fade. James and Sally left no children, no bloodline to carry them forward, but they left behind a space shaped by the belief that some things are worth resisting time for. He came because he believed the place still held unused energy. And then he left, like everyone else who thought they could master Swannanoa. What remains is not ghosts. It is the collision of wealth, power, memory, and human limits. A palace can collapse, but the love that built it refuses to die. Perhaps that is why Swannanoa is still there, not waiting to be saved, but reminding us that power can buy land, money can buy stone, but no one can buy time. And when a dream outlives the people who dreamed it, the question is no longer how long it will last, but who it will haunt next. If you want to keep exploring places like this, places born from ambition, undone by their era, and remembered for the questions they leave behind, continue with the stories now on your screen. And if this story made you pause, even for a moment, leave a comment, like and subscribe to follow the journeys ahead. Thank you for listening. Until next time.